So it was all settled. Ernie and I were getting married on August the 5th. And my friend Jean had an announcement party for me to announce it to my friends. And that was a lot of fun. And then my mother and I enlisted the help of her two younger sisters who lived in Cleburne, Kathleen, Estelle, and Dorothy. Now, they had not been able to have church weddings, and they were very enthusiastic about my wedding and eager to help. So we were very glad to have their help with the preparations and all the planning beforehand. So they suggested that the first thing we needed to do was to go to the florist, since it took so long to get flowers during the war. So we went to see Miss Joyner. Now, Miss Joyner had been doing weddings in Cleburne for as long as I knew, and she was an expert at it. So we went to see her, and I told her the kind of flowers I wanted. She said she couldn't get those. So I said my second choice was she couldn't get those. I gave her my third choice. No, she couldn't get those either. So I finally said I would just accept whatever she could get. She said she had to order them from California, and she was never sure if they would send what she requested, but she would try to get the best that she could for me. So I just had to accept that. And so then we talked about the bouquets and the boutonnieres and the flowers for the reception at our house. And then I said, at the church, since I couldn't have the decorations of flowers that I wanted at the church, I would like to have a lot of candles. And she said, oh, you can't have any candles there. It'll be too hot in August and they'll just melt. Well, I knew she was right. I hadn't thought of that. But that old building, which had no air conditioning, would be hot as blazes in August. And the candles would just melt. And I was so disappointed. But my daddy solved the situation, as he so often did. He said he would take the candles to the ice house and have them frozen. And then he would pick them up just before the wedding and set them in the stands then, and he believed they would stay frozen during the wedding. Well, I believed that he was right. Miss Joyner could not believe it. She had never heard of such a thing. But Daddy was so insistent that she agreed to give him the candles and he would take them to the ice house. And she agreed to set up the stands on the rostrum in the church, the stands to hold all the candles. So all of that was settled. And everything that we needed for the decorations in the house and in the bouquets and in the boutonnieres and all was all settled as best that she could do. And then the next thing was to do a guest list. Now, we realized that we were going to have to invite almost everyone in our church. There had not been a church wedding there in many years, and the people were getting excited about my wedding, and we felt that we had to invite almost all of the members of the church. And then my father had so many business associates that he said had to be invited. And then there were the family, friends, and relatives, and friends that I had to include. And so the guest list became quite long. But we finally completed it. And then we were ready to do the invitations. But before we could do them, we had to decide about the reception. Now, there were two options for the reception. Some people had a big reception for everyone who had been invited to the wedding, and it was in a church hall or some other big hall. Or other people just had a small reception in the parents' home for just the very closest friends and relatives. And we decided that we would prefer to have that smaller reception. That's what my parents preferred. It's what I preferred, and I believed Ernie would prefer it. So we planned to have only the small reception at home. And the way that was handled was the wedding invitation just did not mention a reception. And the few people that were invited to the reception would have a card included in the invitation, a card inviting them to the reception at the parents' home after the wedding. So all of that was planned, and Mother's sisters were so helpful in addressing the envelopes for all of those invitations and stuffing them and preparing them for mailing. That was a big job, and they were so helpful for that. And then I needed to talk to the people who I wanted to have in the wedding. Now, Carter McCamey, who was my parents' minister now, was the minister who had told Ernie about going to seminary in California, and Ernie was so grateful to him. He would be conducting this ceremony. And then I wanted to have my college roommate, the last 2 years I was in college, Drusilla. I wanted Drusilla to be my matron of honor. And then I wanted to have my 2 best friends from high school as bridesmaids. We had kept up with each other since high school and had visited each other in college. And so I invited Jean and Ruth to be bridesmaids in the wedding. And then I wanted Anne to be a junior bridesmaid. And also, I wanted my darling little cousins, Linda and Sandra, to be flower girls. And my cute little cousin, Jimmy, to be the ring bearer. So those would be all of my attendants. And they all accepted, and I was so happy. Now, Ernie, none of Ernie's friends or cousins would be able to come to the wedding because of the war. They were all off somewhere stationed in the armed services. All except Bobby Lee. And so Bobby Lee was chosen to be Ernie's best man. And that would work so well with Drusilla as my matron of honor and her husband Bobby Lee as the best man. And my uncles were chosen to be the ushers, the husbands of my mother's sisters and my mother's brother. So they would be the ushers. So that the members of the wedding party were all chosen. And then we needed to consider about the reception. Now, my mother's 3 sisters, who were so helpful in the planning, would be asked to be in charge of the dining room. They would serve the refreshments and greet with the people there in the dining room. And I wanted my 3 other cousins to be in the house party, along with 2 college friends from Fort Worth. The cousins, Dawn and Francis and Deanne, could all be in the reception and the house party at the reception. And I ask a friend from high school to be at the guest book. So that would be the house party at the reception. And this meant that all of my mother's family was represented in the wedding house party, in the reception house party, or in the wedding itself. They were all represented except for Mother's sister Marie, her husband Bruce, and her daughters Priscilla and Jeannie. They did not get to come to the wedding, and I'm very sorry. I'm not sure why they did not get to come, but I'm so sorry they didn't get to. But that included all of my mother's family, my father's family, the closest members of my father's family had already passed away. So unfortunately, none of them could be there. So we had the people involved and the reception, the invitations sent out. And I forgot to mention, I sent an invitation to 2 people from Trinity that I did not expect to come at all, but I wanted to show my respect for them. And that was Dean Davis, Dean of Women at Trinity, and Mrs. Sims, the librarian at Trinity. I had worked for both of those women and had learned to love them and respect them. They were the most dignified women I knew, but I loved them so much that I wanted to show this respect by inviting them to the wedding. And I even enclosed a card inviting them to the reception, knowing full well that they would not be able to come. I had also invited about 20 friends from Fort Worth whom I had become close friends with in working in Christian Endeavor. And there were several of those were ministerial students who were going to college in Fort Worth but planned to go into the ministry. And they were special friends of mine, so I had invited those, about 20 of those young people. Otherwise, all the guests invited were friends of the family. So, people were invited. The people, those in the wedding and in the house party had been chosen and had accepted. So the next thing was about the wedding gifts. Now, we had no guest registry in Cleburne like they have today. And about the only place you could get a wedding gift in Cleburne was at Dixon's store. And Dixon's store kept calling me and saying that people were coming in and wanting to buy gifts for me, and they needed to know what patterns I wanted to choose. So went down with my mother and my aunts to talk with them. And I was so happy to learn that they could get the pattern of crystal that Ernie had already started for me. And they would be able to get the rest of that pattern, which could be given as gifts. But when it came to China, there was only one pattern of fine china that they could get. And it was much fancier than I would have chosen. But it was the only thing available because of the war. And people were needing to give gifts. And so I just chose that beautiful pattern. There was no such thing as pottery in that. Now, my parents had already said that they wanted to give me the silver flatware, the silverware, and had asked me to choose that when I was in San Antonio. So I had chosen that then, and we already had that, which I was so happy to have. So I had chosen all I could choose, and the gifts started coming in. And we put them on the dining room table. And then the table got full, and we put them on the buffet. And then we had to start stacking them on the dining table and stacking them on the buffet and putting them in chairs and stacking them in chairs. And there were just so many gifts. I don't think it had really occurred to me when we made out that guest list that all of those people would feel that they should give me a wedding gift. And I just was not expecting all of those gifts. And now they were arriving. And it was wonderful. I just appreciated them so much. But I was having trouble finding a place to put them just temporarily. Besides the crystal, there was and all of that china. There were vases and centerpieces and all sorts of unusual things from Dixon's store. Just about everything that they had that could be considered as a wedding gift seemed to be sent. And people had discovered that wool blankets were available. And so some people started giving us wool blankets. And we received 9 wool blankets as wedding gifts. Now, of course, we were thrilled to get them, and they would be very helpful with our family through the years. It was just a matter of where to put them at the time being. So the dining room was full of wedding gifts. And then about a week before the wedding, Willie Dell gave us what she called a gift reception, which meant that everyone she invited to the reception was asked to send a gift, and she would have those gifts on display at her home. Now, she and her husband lived in this wonderful big old Victorian house which her grandparents had built. It was a wonderful place for a party, and it looked like she had invited almost everybody that we had invited to the wedding. She had a huge number of people coming to this reception, gift reception. And it was held on a night. And I was so thrilled because Ernie arrived just before time for that party, so I could take him to the party and introduce him to everyone. And that was a big thrill for me. And the next day, Willie Dell's husband came over with all of those gifts which had been delivered from the guests at their reception. And we thought, where were we going to put those? So my father got storage boxes for us. Now, Ernie and I knew that we would not be using any of these gifts for the next 2 years. We would not use any of them until we came back to Texas. So we wanted to store them until that time. And we got busy and spent the next 3 days packing away in storage boxes all of these wedding gifts and all the gifts from Willie Dell's party. And we got them all packed away, and I have no idea what my father did with those storage boxes, but he had them put away in some safe place for us to have when we returned from California. So that's how Ernie and I spent the first 3 days he was back. And that was he came back about 5 days before the wedding. And then Drusilla and Bobby Lee got there about 2 days before the wedding. And they were very helpful in the all the last minute preparations. And Mrs. Dixon, bless her heart, was not going to be able to be there for the wedding because she had to take Frederick to Warm Springs for treatment. But she left the keys for her house with my father, and she said that Ernie and Bobby Lee could stay at her house. Well, that was wonderful because our house was going to be so crowded. So they stayed there, and that worked out great. And the last 2 days were spent with supervising the preparation for the church and the house. And at the church, my daddy had hired movers to move the pulpit and all of the pews on the rostrum where the choir sat, to move all of those into a Sunday school room for storage temporarily. And that would prepare the rostrum for Miss Joyner to come in with her people to start decorating the rostrum. And then there was our house where the reception was to be after the wedding. And everything was moved out of the dining room except the dining table, because that's where the wedding cake would be put along with the punch bowl and a tray of candy mints. Then every single thing was moved out of the living room, and everything out of the den except the piano, which would be too hard to move. So this made all of those rooms clear for the reception. And the plan was for guests to come in through the den, which was a room that we hardly ever used, and a front door that was never used. So guests would come in through the front door into the den, and my parents and Ernie and I would greet the guests there. And then they could move on into the living room, and there would be a table there with the guest book on it. And then there would be room for people to mill around in the living room, and then to go into the dining room for refreshments. So all of that was planned, and it should work out beautifully. Now, one thing that I forgot to say was that 2 women who were friends, whose husbands were friends of my father's, business friends of my father's, these 2 women had given a lovely party for me earlier on, an afternoon tea, which was so nice. And I had appreciated that so much, just as I appreciated the announcement party which Jean gave and the party which Willie Dale and her husband gave, the tea reception. So, all of this was made ready, and the day of the wedding came.